Okay, this is Carol Merritt talking this afternoon, August the 18th, to Robert Edge, attorney, and he's going to be sharing with us today his experience coming up in Georgia, his reactions to his experience with the 60s, the push for civil rights, and how it was from his perspective. So, Mr. Edge, if you would just begin telling me where you grew up in this area and what your experience was like growing up in a community that would eventually have to face head-on the issue of race and civil rights.
Well, I'm glad to. I grew up in Lawrenceville, Georgia, which is between Athens and Atlanta. And, but our gravitational pull was to Atlanta, where we did lots of stuff. And so, like all of Georgia, when I was growing up, it was totally segregated with all the bad features of that era. And but I also was growing up at a time when the great cracks were coming about. And when you called and said you wanted to talk to me, I think one of the first points of focus you had in mind was I was asked to speak to the legislature in, I guess, the spring of 1960. I had won a Rhodes Scholarship while I was a senior at the University of Georgia, and I was headed for Oxford. And so there was, some pride in, the public university guy being elected to go to Oxford. And so I was asked to speak to the legislature, and what in the world does a 21, 22-year-old guy say under those circumstances? And the big debate of the moment was really what was going to happen to the public schools. The school desegregation decision had been rendered about 5 years earlier. And so Georgia was grappling with the whole issue of integration of schools, and they appointed this great man, John Sibley, to head a commission that would help develop the state's position on that issue. And so they were in the middle of that debate when I was asked to speak to the legislature, and it was not a hard decision for me, because my position was so clear. I mean, the idea of closing the schools was just not acceptable at all. But even though it was not acceptable to me and others, people wouldn't speak out because of the feared consequences of speaking out. And I was maybe naive enough or something. I did make this statement, and the article that I think led to your asking me to speak to you today, evidently, according to the fellow who wrote that article, and I think it was Bruce Goffin, he reported it was the first time that anyone had publicly taken that position in the Georgia legislature. At least that's my recollection. I haven't read the article in 25 years, I guess. And so it was, anyhow, if it's not the first, it was an unusual occasion, and that's why it got some, notoriety. That one was real easy, for me, but the fact that could be a serious debate tells you just exactly, how strong the feelings were, by so many people in the state about the integration of schools issue. Throughout my time at the University of Georgia, it was a completely segregated institution. But there were conversations, going on. People were really wrestling with this, and people saying we have got to change, we have got to take these steps. And so, these were debates, because the debates were people who would say, absolutely not, we will never do that. And we'd say, wait a minute, that doesn't make any sense. It's the law, and it's the right thing to do, and we've got to do it. And those conversations, were ongoing. I was in a debating society called Phi Kappa, and it was, and we had wonderful debates, and and throughout the campus you could have debates. And as I thought about the civil rights era, I have compared my experiences at a segregated institution like the University of Georgia. And I've compared that, where you could have real conversations, about civil rights matters. I compared that to my experience after Oxford. I went to Yale Law School. And Yale Law School, absolutely bastion of civil rights, and especially First Amendment rights. And when I think of my personal experience, in about civil rights and conversations about civil rights, one of the ironies to me was that there were not any real conversations about, kind of civil rights and kind of the implications of various moves and timings and that sort of thing. There were not real conversations, because if you want to say, wait a minute, we've got to be careful about going too fast about this, that, or the other, because, of what might happen. We may get the wrong result. We're trying to get integrated schools. If we do it on this basis, we may end up with just either all black public schools and all white private schools. And we will need to avoid that. But if you wanted to say, let's be careful, or to have a conversation, that was not acceptable in New Haven, in this bastion of free speech, and because there was only, one view. And if you said, wait a minute, let's tap the brake slightly, then you're going to be a racist. And consequently, that puts you, if you were not a racist and you were suddenly being accused of being a racist, or having those tendencies, then, you just clam up and you don't talk.
Whereas at University of Georgia, you have felt free.
Absolutely.
In spite of the fact that there would have been others that were strongly segregationists.
Absolutely. And, and that's always struck me as being so ironic, that we could have real conversations in segregated Athens, University of Georgia, and literally 5 years later, 6 years later, could not have those conversations, in New Haven. Because if you wanted to say, well, let's be careful about this implication or that implication, or what may happen as you're dealing with, really for tremendous changes in what had been a totally segregated society in the South. If you voiced any of those, let's be careful, or not, let's watch the timing here, then that was not acceptable. You were a racist, and, let's move on past you.
What years were you at Yale?
I was at 62 to 65. And it was, this was really the heart of the big civil rights, movement and the legislation. I was actually working in Washington when some of the great, decisions came down and some of the legislation was passed, Civil Rights Act. Very interesting time, to be there. But I have often laughed about it to myself, about how ironic it was that, you really could not have better conversations when in a place where you should be able to discuss anything, and you really couldn't. And I don't remember there being really good conversations in Oxford either. Basically, they just didn't have much diversity, quite frankly, and so it was more an abstraction, in England at that time, for many people, especially in the university setting. And now, the first Ghanaian Rhodes Scholar was in my college, when I was there. But this was kind of, you would have one person. And, I think that if you're talking about how are you going to deal with having two black people, everybody else in the college white, and maybe one Asian, and maybe one something else, whatever it may be. the dynamics are very different than when you're talking about, we've got about, it's 60-40 or 50-30, and how do those people deal with each other after having been kept apart for so long. And so they didn't have many points of reference, I felt, in England, when all this ferment, was going on in this country. Now they and they certainly have come to it later, but at the time we were dealing with those issues in the South in a very different way, of course.
What were some of the practical considerations that you wished, say, had been considered in the whole school desegregation issue here in Atlanta?
Well, I'm not. I really am not really equipped to talk about specific moves, and I don't remember the conversations. But I do remember that basically, there was this fear that if you move too carefully and we don't have the right plans in place, you can end up with all black public schools and all white Christian academies, or whatever they were called, and nobody wanted that result. And I'm not sure it could have been avoided, but you at least need to talk about it. And it's what are the pros and the cons? And all of these issues, I think, are very difficult, and there are pros and cons of any big social moves, at least in the short term. And I think you have to be very careful. And so, what are the implications, of busing, and on the children, among other things, and for some it's very, very good. Other people it's very, I think, unfortunate, the long bus rides that those young children had to take. And so mine is, I'm not here as an advocate, for anything that was done or not done. I'm an advocate for discussions, in a really realistic, honest way. And that's hard for people to do, because we get so tied up in our own positions, our own emotions. We don't want to suggest anything that might, resemble being on the other side. And, and finally you've got to come down. I'm not trained as a lawyer, so it's easier for me to say, I won't look at it from this side. Now I want to look at it from the totally different side. And lawyers are better at that than a lot of people. They can't, they let their emotions get in the way of their analysis. And I think in the healthier conversation when you're dealing with a serious problem is, really making certain that you are really analyzing and not just reflecting your emotion. Does that make any sense to you?
Oh yeah, it does. And so the Sibley Committee, at least strategically, forced a discussion, hearings on an issue.
Absolutely.
Without which, what probably would have happened?
Well, I don't know, because there was that threat, that they would just close the schools. Now that was not going to last for long. That was not going to be in the cards, but at least, and it happened in other places, and thank goodness it didn't happen here. And we've got to thank, that commission. And John Sibley was a terrific guy. But he was a very much old school and, raised in the segregated, but he had that broader term wisdom, and he could analyze, and, and consequently, we were, I think, very fortunate that he was asked to head that commission, because he brought a really thoughtful perspective that some other people who might have been named Jim would not have had, I can guarantee you.
Okay. So then, coming back to Atlanta after Yale as a lawyer,
Right.
What was that whole scene like?
Well, Atlanta's still a very, segregated city in 1965, and I remember after the Civil Rights Act saying you've got, public accommodations, and you'd go to a restaurant like the Top of the Mark, which was one of our leading restaurants, and I don't know how many people they have, there's 60 there, but it created a real stir for a black person to come in. I mean, there was this electricity in the room. I mean, it seems so absurd, I mean, today, but it was. And that's the nature, of major social change. But I mean, I can't imagine, we can't imagine it, today. But I mean, that's clearly the way it was. And then there were going to be, some of those restaurants that were going to find a way or another, they were not going to have any black people coming in one way or the other. And so that was the Atlanta I came back to. And there is a kind of a funny story here. That my first day at going to work, and this was 35 Broad Street, CNS National Bank building where Alston, Miller and Gaines was located. And I was approaching the building to go to work, and I thought I'd come up on a civil rights demonstration, because there were all of these, black women standing outside, African American women, and here they are all standing outside. I thought, this is a demonstration. And I thought, and I'm going to have to walk through this demonstration to get to my first day on the job. Anyway, of course, it wasn't a demonstration at all. That was where they caught the buses. But I mean, it was, and I thought about, that feeling and all of the things that now, they seem crazy then, but they're crazy now that people, that all of the turmoil that you had to go through, it just seems preposterous, at this point. But I mean, in the law firm, and I was part of a progressive, law firm, and we were reaching for a black lawyer, and John Kennedy was, I think we were about the first major firm in Atlanta to hire a black lawyer. And John Kennedy had gone to Harvard. He was a wonderful guy. He died young, unfortunately, but he stayed with us for a few years, and then he left because the opportunities, he just had better opportunities in joining an all-black firm.
Oh, okay. So what year, if you can remember, when he came?
He must have come in 68.
Okay.
69. It's the late 60s, as I recall. But it just wasn't, it wasn't just an issue of black attorneys. It also applied to women. There were some women who did legal work in law offices, but it was under a special circumstance, and they were really not. You couldn't say that there were women who were really part of the bar, except in these very rare exceptions, and there would generally be some special reason, and that occurs. See, around 1970 also, when law firms, late 60s, early 70s, then started admitting one woman, and then maybe 2 years later you might admit another woman. So I mean, it was not just racial, it was also on the issue of women. And when the first woman to be admitted to membership at the Commerce Club in the early 70s, I guess, it was a big deal. And I think, I may be wrong, but certainly one, if she wasn't the first, she was the second or third, but Orinda Evans, who is, a judge on the Northern District of Georgia. She was part of our firm, and she was admitted to the Commerce Club, and that was a big deal. I mean, you can't imagine it was a big deal, but it was. I mean, the first whatever else.
I'm curious, so what are the issues? What are the discussions that happened before that kind of decision?
Well,
was
I mean,
made?
from the old guard, this is a men's club. We don't have women in the Commerce Club, and because it had been that way, and the Commerce Club had certainly got to that stage before most private clubs, and so I mean, this is not knocking the Commerce Club. It's just the opposite. Commerce Club was the about the first club that I recall, admitting women and as to, members, and so it was just it was more, it was all those crazy things. I mean, first of all, this is we were founded as a men's club. We're gonna stay as a men's club. That was what the old guard said, and that was the position they came from. And then another thing, well, we won't be able to talk the way, with women. We won't have to do that. I mean, it was kind of, it was the fear of change.
And the same rationale for admitting blacks.
Absolutely.
Okay.
I mean,
So how did it happen? How did the change come?
Well, it came because, it happened because of the law.
Okay.
And then it happens because people in power said, it's wrong, and I'm going to use my business clout. I'm going to use my power to change it. So it's not just the politicians and the law. It is people with clout who would say, we're going to do this, and that's, yeah, I always think about Dr. King and his being honored, and the stand of Robert Woodruff, and saying that we're going to do this. And so he says to his folks, make this happen, make it happen right.
You're talking about the Nobel Peace
Well,
Prize
exactly.
dinner, that biracial.
Yeah, exactly.
That I understand the businessmen at first were very reluctant until Woodruff with his power.
And so you say, why did it come about? It came about because of the law. It came about because people with business clout. And then I am sure, not having any specific examples, but I'm sure it also came about, because there were, here is, the big powerful Mr. Woodruff, but there were small people who took stands at the right moment, and stood up and spoke, and then everybody said, I may not like it, but it's right. And, and so this smaller person, makes that statement. This, I can't, don't remember her name, Miss Sheehan, I can't remember, but this woman who is standing outside President Bush's ranch in Texas saying, I want to talk about this. I mean, she's not the big powerful figure, but she's taking a stand, and it has caught the attention of the media, and and it is having an impact. And and I think that probably happened, throughout the South, in different ways. There would be some respected figure who had, always belonged to the old school, belonged to all the whatevers, and at the right moment had the courage, the profiling courage, ideas to stand up and be counted. And and kind of gradually enough people did that you get the social change. I love reading history and read a fair amount about the Civil War, and one of my favorite stories is after the Civil War was over, and Robert E. Lee was in the big Episcopal church, I guess, in Richmond, and came time for communion, and a black man, African American, I guess, went to the altar and knelt. Well, they didn't know what to do. I mean, no black person had ever knelt at the altar of this for communion. Imagine this, and it was just this awkward moment of, where the priest going to serve him or not, what was going to happen. And then there's Robert E. Lee got up and went and knelt by the man. And I think that's one of the most powerful statements you can imagine. And not by Robert E. Lee, but I think that happened, throughout the South as people just came to recognize this is the right thing to do, and I will do it. And if the ladies in my sewing circle don't like it, I can't help it. And so I think that's that doesn't get counted. It's not dramatic, but I think that's how social change comes about.
On a lesser scale, it reminds me of Hartsfield's reaction when the police told him that there were some blacks that were at the Civic Center for I think it was a symphony or some kind of a theater production. Mm-hmm. And his response was, "Well, just go ahead and start the show."
Yeah.
Just start the show.
Well, that's exactly right. And you do have this. You have the breakthroughs created by artists. Mm-hmm. You're following Manuel Dobbs, a friend of mine, Jesse Norman's friend of mine. And I've been blessed to know some of these great people. And Manuel Dobbs, Mayor Jackson's aunt. Mm-hmm. Just one of the most beautiful, wonderful people I've ever known. And she talks about when she was young and going to the theater and having to sit up in the top, and then later on she's the star of the show. Mm-hmm. And to see that during your lifetime. But artists have made a real contribution. Mm-hmm. And I'm so interested in the arts that I take real pride. Mm-hmm. And in the fact that that is a real contribution that artists make. Mm-hmm. And again, it's if you can sing a high C the way Leontine Price I see, I think they're even some of the most committed, segregationists. They loved hearing Leontine Price, and those things, help widen the crack. And it happened throughout the arts.
Okay. When you were younger and coming up in Atlanta, and before
Lawrenceville,
yeah, Atlanta area, but Lawrenceville,
right.
Before things got to be at least token integrated.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Did you have any contacts with blacks?
Oh yeah.
What was your exposure to?
Well, basically, in small towns, you had interaction, all the time. It is not on a socially equal basis. But there was tremendous interaction out of necessity. Mm-hmm. The people, they're not in school with you. Mm-hmm. When I was there, but basically, kind of, they are the working force. Mm-hmm. And so it was. I don't suggest at all that it was. The friendships were on a basis of equality, but there was a lot of interaction. And in so much of this country, there was just no interaction between blacks and whites. They just didn't have any.
Not in the
black
North.
people. They didn't have any.
Yeah. Or even if they did, there wasn't that same degree of interaction.
That's right. And it's and again, you think about there was a lot of affection. There still were always. I'm not trying to say there were not gaps. But there was interaction.
Would you have known blacks in families? Would you have known them and known something about their families?
Well, yes, in this sense that, my parents had a restaurant. Mm-hmm. And so, they employed blacks and whites, and so we saw, we knew the grandmama and the mama and the grandson. Mm-hmm. And we were having interactions, that way. And, that was just the economic structure. you had to interact. You know, the whites needed the black workers, black workers needed the white employers. And it was, that's just the way it was. But I mean, I think they were in so many other places, they didn't have any interaction. And you know, here I am, and Betty and I have two daughters. Well, I'll step back, and you know, lots of people feel sorry for my Atlanta friends. Feel sorry for those of us who grew up in little country towns. And I think there are lots of advantages of growing up in a little country town. And one of them is that everybody is in the same rowboat. I mean, you know, you played with everybody. I mean, you played with everybody. Now, there was not much playing with black children and white children. There was some, but I mean, you know, you would not, in my era, 50, 60 years ago, that they would not be invited to your birthday party, because that was not socially acceptable in a segregated society. And, you know, but everybody, the people you played with might be very poor. And, you know, or they might have a little more money, but everybody played together. And, you know, in a town like Atlanta, that doesn't happen in the same way. And,
You got a class segregation.
And, you know, I've often thought that, you know, our girls growing up, they really didn't know disadvantaged people. There was nothing in their lives, you know, that gave them, you know, an opportunity really to know and live with and understand disadvantaged people. They just didn't know it. And I think that's real sad. And that's one of the advantages, I think, of growing up in a little country town, is that, you know, you can play with the poorest children, or might play with the doctor's children, or whatever. And then I think you start evaluating people on a different basis. And another thing, I mean, I will say to you, there was a shoe shine man named Miller Neal in Lawrenceville, and he had the respect of everybody. And he was viewed as, you know, he had this leadership position because he was hardworking, he was honest, he was always, you know, he was just such a very good man, and he was recognized as, you know, a leader of that community, and given the respect. Given the respect, I mean, you know, if I had done anything rude, you know, or been disrespectful, my daddy would have worn me out, because that was not acceptable. I mean, he was entitled to full respect, and that was true of, you know, hardworking, God-fearing people, and that was a judgment that was made. And later on, my father was head of the public housing, you know, of the board of civic board of the public housing
In Lawrenceville?
in Lawrenceville. And I mean, you know, but he was a businessman, but he had this job, and I mean, this civic role. And one thing he wanted to do was have a street named for Miller Neal, because I mean, everybody respected him so much, and there's just something so nice about being to evaluate the worth of someone divorced of, you know, how much are you making, or and that's much more likely to happen in a small town than maybe some other places.
It's very different now.
Very different.
There's no opportunities.
No opportunity.
One of the things I wanted to ask you about was Atlanta as a city, and how its experience with civil rights was really quite different from most cities in the South, Deep South.
Yeah.
And so what was distinctive about Atlanta?
Well, I can't can't offer myself as a historian, but I at least, my best understanding is that's attributable to the leadership. I mean, the blessing that we had in having Mayor Hartsfield and Ivan Allen, it was, you replace those kinds of figures with the sort of people we saw in Birmingham and some other places, then Atlanta would not have achieved what it achieved. I mean, we will never, we can never honor Mayor Hartsfield and Mayor Allen sufficiently for helping, the community, change. And what a wonderful, and Maynard Jackson to that too. Thank goodness for, having a person of his quality, understanding, we want change, but we want to change in the right way, and let's not rush it too much and produce the wrong reaction. And that's very hard. I think that's, would be very difficult. And then, there are the, Atlanta just had Morris Abram and people like that. Morris Abram was the guy who really led the fight against the county unit system. He's from Fitzgerald, a little country, segregated town. Rhodes Scholar. I take great pleasure in knowing that, and the change that he made. And then you get Michael Lomax. I mean, he did a wonderful job. White Fowler, what he did. Elliot Levitas. I mean, we had people, and I'm missing a lot of names, but those are some who come to mind. We had wonderful people, who helped this community move from here to there in a better way than a lot of other cities. And you can add to that, Carol, a Robert Shaw. And Robert Shaw, it was talent, who are the people who can produce the right music, but he really reached, and so he wanted to, feature black artists and black choruses. And that was such a part of his, agenda. And it's part of his agenda not without sacrifice. He wasn't sacrificing inequality. It was, no, this chorus is just as good, we're going to use them. This soloist, we're going to have them. And that's how it happens.
I'm wondering also the presence of the black institutions in Atlanta, higher education, out of which Maynard Jackson and others came.
No question.
That developed the leadership within the black community.
And no question about that. And I think that having a group of really such fine educators, they really were a major factor. I'm glad you remembered that.
So you've had some exposure and direct experience with the segregation in schools issue. Were there any other issues that came up during the Civil Rights era that you had a special perspective on? Any special perspective or thoughts about the student movement that came out of Atlanta University?
Well, the one thing I do remember, I think that the student movement, they were far more aggressive, and they were far more out front and far more, in your face. And so that was very hard. I mean, that's what scared people. Okay. And it often, I think, led to entrenchment. You need it. You need to have it nonetheless. And so they served, you got to have the people who are pushing. You can't just, everybody, be dealing with the more comfortable people. You got to have these people who are pushing. And they did that. And, sometimes it went too far. You know, one thing that I do have an observation. Sometimes the local institutions that were really ahead of the pack, you know, in making the social change, you know, accepting the civil rights changes that were there, they would then be picked out and become a focus and made to look, you know, as really the worst culprits. And I'm thinking in that regard of, and this is my understanding of, and maybe this is not right, but this is my understanding, Riches. And Richard Rich was one of those far-sighted leaders and, you know, kind of really pushing and the whole thing. But you still got to hold on to your customer base. And so there was, I mean, there were restrictions on, you know, black customers, you know, trying on the clothes or whatever else, or something along that. And it was, I remember, despite the fact he had been at the forefront among Atlanta businessmen, in, you know, in kind of making the necessary change. I mean, his store is selected for some push, and I don't know what the push was, that, you know, kind of had big business implications. And so you'd say, well, he's been better than all the rest, why don't you do that to somebody else? But the point was made by the person who was most progressive or most out front, which again, I think it's, and I guess it has to happen that way.
Yeah. And I think even within the black community, there was dissension on the students attacking Riches for the eating facilities.
Exactly. Attack one of the real rednecks, the real
yeah, but I think that's why the students chose him, because they knew if they could break Riches,
exactly.
then they'd have the other
Yeah.
stores to fall in line. So it cut both ways.
Or maybe that's the way to say it. Another way to say it is to say, you may be doing more than others, but it's still not enough, and we're not going to accept it. And that's more what I would say is going on. And again, but all this, you know, you want to get from here to there, but what's your timetable? People can decide, well, you know, let's get there in 3 hours. And others, no, I want to get there in an hour. And that leads people, and that was at the heart of the disagreements that occurred within the black community. You know,
Yeah, they had the old guard too.
oh, absolutely.
That was used to the gradualism and negotiating behind the scene, and I tend to agree with you. You need both.
Oh, you need both. Yeah, I mean, you need both. I was blessed to get to represent I think she's probably my all-time favorite client was this great lady, Lucy Rucker Aiken. And, you know, and hearing her talk about her experiences, just unbelievable, you know, and those stories are just incredible. And seeing her reaction to the civil rights movement, and she was one part of that old guard, you know, not comfortable with it, you know, and, you know, she had a little more money to give away, and she was so afraid that her money was going to be diverted to some of those, you know, the people that she disagreed with their timetable and their methodology. And, you know, but what a great, wonderful person she was. And, you know, she left some money to the Community Foundation and to do, and it ended up going to libraries, and there's a lecture series here. But it had to be, she was going to give it away in a different way if you really want the truth. And I said, no, you need to do something, Ms. Aiken, you know, that, you know, will be helpful to this library at Atlanta University or something. But she was so afraid her money would get diverted. Needed to support, you know, some of those
the students that were coming
out
of there.
Exactly. You know, which I thought was, you know, very interesting. I mean, she wanted no part of it at all. She was old
But her
school.
estate, her property Did it not go to Atlanta University, Clark Atlanta University?
Yes, and but I mean, that was not easy. I mean, she had to get over, the hurdle because she did not want. I mean, she didn't like the techniques because she was such a lady. I mean, she was such a lady, and she wanted to have no part of any of those what she viewed as being kind of unacceptable methods. I still miss her.
Yeah. So what's your assessment of where we are now? The change that's happened in really a very short period of time.
It's unbelievable.
Where are we now?
Well, Atlanta is, we are so much more integrated than most cities. I mean, I don't think Boston comes close to being as integrated as Atlanta is. And I think, that's true of, a lot of other places. Atlanta's a truly integrated city. And I wonder where, I always was an admirer of Hubert Humphrey. But, Hubert Humphrey could afford to, make all of his statements. His constituency, they were all white. And it's a lot of the northern cities, and thank goodness, they represent the right view. But they don't live with integration the way we do in Atlanta. They don't. And so I really have I take a lot of pride in how integrated our society is here in Atlanta. There's still different forms of segregation, but that's going to be. I believe that'll always be true across the board. I wonder whether any societies anywhere in the world where some of it doesn't happen. And Atlanta, I think on a practical basis is. And I tell my friends from other parts of the country, I said, you don't know what you're talking about. You coming from a part, you don't have any diversity in your community. So the dynamics of dealing with these things are very, very different for you. It's an abstraction to you. It's easy to have abstract commitments, isn't it? But I take real pride in how well Atlanta, and when you think in terms of, it is just not that long ago. It is, 40 years ago, black people were not, there was no black person in a white restaurant in Atlanta.
I wanted to ask you about, you had said that you were in Washington about the time of the Voting Rights Act. Can you share with us something that, you recall of that period, some of the...
Well, I can't do a lot of that, because I was always a member of the liberal group. I was always delighted with, and so it was a very heady time, if you were a young liberal, student, to be in Washington when these great, legislative developments like the Civil Rights Act were passed. And
this was right after you got out of Yale.
no, it's while I'm at Yale.
Oh, okay.
I was working for two Southern congressmen one summer.
Okay. Who were they?
Bob Stevens and Phil Landrum. And wonderful people, and but it was such an exciting time because you knew that you were witnessing a real changing of our world that had to happen, needed to happen, was the right thing to happen. And the real issue was not the long term, but kind of what are the intermediate steps that will work best. And some people were more thoughtful about trying to address those intermediate steps than others.
Well, we're about at the end of our interview, and I just want to thank you for sharing with us.
Carol, I enjoyed it.